Thanks for joining my session instead of Andy's. I know Andy has a lot of cool stuff to discuss, but I think my stuff are even more cool than his stuff. But yeah, everybody will say that about his own presentation. Um, the need for speed. But before we dive into the things that we like, the details, I first want to look at the agenda. And I think this is kind of like the topic you all came for. That's about me. So let's just start with that. After that, we will dive into the need for speed, also look at some business value, and also try to correlate the business value also to an automation strategy. And that's kind of like more a theoretical thing. Then I also want to look into how can you kind of like improve your test cases based on some cool things also within SaaS Labs, but also within how you should run or how you can run your test cases on your local machine or in SaaS Labs. And last but not least, I want to dive into some new ways how you can use SaaS Labs. And those are kind of like features that maybe we had for 3 years and not even a lot of people know, including also some new features that we have for mobile devices, which can be, I think, really useful also for people who are working in the financial market. And in the end, we will have a Q&A. So first of all, like I said, I think the reason why you came here about me, just kidding. I'm a senior solutions architect within SaaS Labs, and basically what I do within SaaS Labs is I'm not selling stuff. I'm here to help customers get the most value out of the product. And especially if they have questions about automation strategies, about automation challenges, or if they just want to have someone to talk to, I'm basically there to help them. I'm also a speaker at multiple conferences like Selenium Conference, Appium Conference, SaaSCon. You might have seen me at some places. Also the contributing author to 2 books. A friend of mine asked me a few years ago when he was writing a book if I wanted to write a chapter in his book. So in the first book that you're seeing there, I wrote a chapter about how to use open source software within large organizations. And when he wrote his second book, he also asked me to write a chapter, and I wrote a chapter about how to use Appium together with React Native and some best practices about it. So if you want to read it, you can order them on Amazon, and you will even fund some charities. I also love open source, and this is also the reason why I really love SaaS Labs, because they're basically one of the biggest contributor to a lot of open source projects that kind of like rely or you need to use for UI automation. I'm also the creator of WebDriver.io Appium Boilerplate. If you want to start using WebDriver.io and if you want to start using it together with Appium, there's an easy boilerplate hopefully for you that could help you kind of like get that jump start. And I also like to contribute in the project with other modules, fixes, or answering questions also for people. If you want to know more about me, you can find me on LinkedIn, you can find me on Twitter, and you can also find me on GitHub, and there you will find some projects that I've created that could be useful if you're doing JavaScript automation. But enough about me. Let's kind of like look at the reason why you're really here. And it's the need for speed. And so you might be wondering, are you here to show me one of the 7 or 8 movies here? No, we're here for test automation. So do we talk about the cars? Yes or no? Well, yes, I wanted to show you a little bit. It's not apart from need for speed, but I wanted to show you a little bit about cars. Because if we look at our tests, we want to compare ourselves to be, for example, the smart. We want to be smarter. We want to create smaller test cases maybe, or we want to be faster at least. And this is kind of like the thing that I want to focus on. But we also need to think about, can we reach that with a very small car? So keep that just in the back of your mind. But if we now just go back to why do we really need to have that speed? Why do we need to have that speed when we're talking about automation? Well, this is kind of like something that Matt also shown in his presentation. When we look at kind of like the continuous testing, we will have multiple phases, and each phase will be followed by a testing phase. And the faster the testing phase will be, the faster your feedback will be. So need for speed for testing? Yes, we need it, but is it really good? Is it kind of like the biggest reason? Well, when I was a QA, I really hated waiting on test cases. I wanted to have my fast feedback, because if I needed to wait too long on my test cases, I needed to get coffee for all my colleagues. And yeah, I would rather have coffee from my colleagues instead of giving them coffee. So I wanted to have that fast feedback when I was running it on my local machine or in the cloud. Secondly, if you would look at why do you need to have that speed, developers, they also don't want to wait a long time. They want to have fast test cases for unit tests, but if there's something wrong with your application, you want to have that fast feedback. You want to give them that specific issue so they can fix it, and you can go kind of like deploy it to production as soon as possible. And last but not least, and this is very important, it's the time to market. And this is also an interesting one, the time to market, because this one brings me also to the following point, and that's the business value of what we're doing with automation. And if we're talking about that, before we dive into the details, I just want to ask you a question. And this is a question that a colleague of mine, Titus Fortner, is asking a lot of times, and that's this question. And for the people who never had this question, do you know what the money wants? You might be looking like this. Like, what money? What do you mean with that? And basically what I mean with that, what we mean with this question is, do you know what the manager of your manager's manager wants? Does he really want to have optimized test cases? Does he really want to have a really nice and shiny automation framework? I don't think so. I think if you would look at what the manager of your manager's manager wants, the real business value, that would be that he or she would like to have more sales. He or she would like to have more users, to deliver quality software more frequently, and last but not least, to be ahead of the competition. I think this is the most important part. If we're working in retail, or if we're working in the finance world, we always want to add something extra. We want to distinguish ourselves to our competitors. So we want to be ahead of our competition. And then you might be wondering, okay, awesome, but how do you do that? Well, we just go back to kind of like the buzzwords we have in our industry. That's continuous integration, and that's continuous delivery. That will help you kind of like ship your product faster to the market, to help your customers. When you have an issue, remove that issue as soon as possible from production. But if you're thinking about those buzzwords, have you ever thought about testing? And well, if we just look at this is kind of like someone who wants to lift a container or shift a container. This went completely wrong because he didn't thought about the edge cases in this case. And as testers, we're always good at thinking about edge cases. So they should have tested this. So if you would then go back and think about continuous delivery, it requires the continuous testing. But when you're thinking about continuous testing, I think it also requires an automation strategy. And then last but not least, it is something that, oh, I was too fast with my clicks. Let's go back. If you would think about the automation strategy, hopefully the point will come on now. Yes. If you will think about the automation strategy, you also need to think about atomic and autonomous test cases. So those are kind of like the three things that I want to cover today. Think about the automation strategy, also think about the atomic and autonomous test cases, and see the atomic and the autonomous more as the small car, the smart against the Mustang. Will we be faster, yes or no? Will we be smarter, yes or no? So before we want to dive into those atomic autonomous test cases, I first want to look at the automation strategy. And before we dive into the automation strategy, I just want to show you the app that we're going to use, which is our SaaS demo app, during the phase where we're going to cover the automation strategy. And this is just a very simple application which can be compared to what a lot of our customers are doing. They need to have a login flow, a checkout flow, entering some data, retrieving some text, kind of like the basic steps. And if you would look at this and then especially look at the login form and think about test cases, then we could have kind of like some simple test cases like, does the page load properly? That could be one test case if we would look at the login form. Then we could also look, okay, what will happen if I would use valid credentials? Can I log in and go to the next page, kind of like the happy flow? So that would also be a test case. Then I've got multiple error flows in my application. What will happen if I do not use a username? What will happen if I do not fill in a password? What will happen if I use incorrect credentials? Or what will happen if I'm a logged out user? If I'm logged out, I cannot enter with my credentials. And if you would think of this and then would want to run them on, for example, some browsers, you say, okay, I want to run them on Chrome. I want to run them on Firefox. I want to run them on Safari. I want to run them on IE 11. There are still customers and end users use IE 11. So please try to use that also. And also on Edge. And I've added 2 icons here of Edge. We've got the old version of Edge, which is the version up to version 18, where and Microsoft had their own engine. And then we've got Edge, kind of the newest one, which is based on Chromium. Always add them also to your test cases, especially the old one. But if you would then look at this, you want to think about the platforms. And if you would then do some calculation, you will see that you will have 7 different configurations, 6 test cases, only for the login form, 42 tests, and the test execution will be between 1 and 2.5 minutes. And you might now be wondering, okay, what 1 to 2.5 minutes? Why? Well, there might be an issue in your, for example, your environment where you're not able to run test cases in parallel due to some test data. That might increase the execution time. But if you're here, you've got those 42 test cases. I think this is kind of like the point where you need to realize this is only one feature, one simple feature, the login feature. And this might be the point where you also need to think of an automation strategy. Maybe it's too late because you already created at least 6 test cases. But if you're at this point, rethink your automation strategy. And to do so, I want to get back to last year. I want to go back to SaaSCon 2019, where I met Guido also. We were at the same plane, same airport, same bus. And it was this conference, SaaSCon, Keep Testing Weird. And there was one presentation that was really, really good, that like drew my attention. And that was the talk from Richard Bradshaw. And his talk was about pyramids or Asians. And he talked about using a pyramid as a testing strategy. And I really agreed with what he was saying, because he was not fond of people using the pyramid for the automation strategy. And what he saw and what he mentioned is that everybody saw kind of like the UI as the main point to test everything. A lot of testers were pushed into automation and they want to verify and test everything through the UI. But they were never pushed to look at different layers. And if you would now kind of like look at releasing faster more often, if you would have 5,000 UI test scripts, it will be very hard to kind of like get that fast feedback. So what he did, he introduced a new visual approach for the test automation strategy. And I will dive into that in a few seconds. But what I really liked is he gave a presentation about the different types of pyramids. We've got pyramids, and he said, well, they're not pyramids, they're even just triangles. We even got an ice cone triangle, and we even got that detailed that we added specific layers, percentages, and which should make everything more clear. And basically what he wanted to say here is, let's just take a look at your application. What is your application doing? And divide that into layers. And he came up with this one, this layer structure, which I really like. And I want to also use that today. If we would just look at the login flow, and you can do this with every application you have. It doesn't matter if this is a mobile native, hybrid, or a web application. You can do that for each feature or even for each application or device. So for now, we're just going to take the login flow, and we're trying to divide the login flow and the application into multiple layers. Where we've got the UI layer, you can test that with Selenium, or you can test that, for example, with Appium. Then we also got the JavaScript layer. In this case, we're talking about our demo app, and the demo app has been created with React, and a unit testing framework, which is used a lot with React, is Jest. Then you would have your API layer, and if you would look at an API layer, then you would say, okay, you could test it with Rest Assured, most common library, or you can use it with Karate, or you can use it with Supertest. There are a lot of options also to test your API. And depending on the complexity of your application, You would have an app layer and you would have a database layer, but our application is not that complex. It only has 2 layers, but yeah, let's not dive into that too much detail. But this will give you a good overview about the amount of layers that this application could have had, or maybe your application has. And if we would now focus on, for example, a simple test case, a potential test case like login, what will happen? Well, what will happen is that a user, he will open a browser. And when he opens the browser, he will type in the URL. And if you would now think, what will happen? Well, we can just draw some lines, put some dots and draw some lines, where you would say, okay, if I open the URL, then there's an action from the UI going to the JavaScript layer, and it will ask the JavaScript layer, what should I do? Well, because this is the first time you're visiting the website, it will render a form and it will show you the form in your browser. But this is not the only thing a customer will do. He will not look at your application for hours. No, he will also do some interaction. So the next step would be the interaction on the page and just doing a login. And what will happen then is he will enter his credentials, and the credentials are passed to the JavaScript layer, and the JavaScript layer will say, okay, I need to send an API request. That one will go to the API layer if you have a complexer application. Then it will go even to an app layer, get the token. It will go back, send the API response. And in the end, the API response is given back to the JavaScript layer. Then the JavaScript layer needs to think what it needs to do. Is it a successful or is it an unsuccessful response? So based on that, he will render a new view, and then it will be shown in your browser. But if you would look at all those points, kind of like all those potential checks, and you would also look at the layers, you will see that you can, for example, easily test only 4 test cases here. Because if you would do that for each layer, you can kind of like look at the responsibility each layer has. The only thing you need to do then is just have some happy flows to verify kind of like the integration, but not test everything, getting a token specifically or an unhappy token through the UI. And what I wanted to do, like I said, our application is not that complex. So I'm not going to focus on the API, the app, or the database layer. We're going to focus on the JavaScript layer. So if we do that, we just need to focus on them both, and then we just need to decouple them. And when we do that, we look at our application and we basically need to turn it around a little bit, as you can see here. We need to go to the JavaScript layer, because that's basically where all the magic is happening, this magic. So let's take a look at JavaScript unit testing and how JavaScript unit testing can help you writing UI automation tests. I'm not expecting now from you that you can write JavaScript unit tests. The only thing that I kind of like expect from you after this part is that you understand what is happening and that you can have the good conversation with your developer about what to test where. But if we would go back to the basics, and if we go to JavaScript unit testing, you will see that it can lead to 40 to 80% reduction in production bugs. It can improve the application architecture, maintainability, lead to better APIs, and it will at least also give you the quick feedback on file save, because especially for JavaScript, if you just adjust some stuff in your application, in your source code, you could just have a watcher and run all those unit test cases for you and just see if it breaks something, yes or no. And that will also introduce the safety net for you or for the developer to add or refactor existing features. But there's more. It's not only these. These are not the only advantages for doing JavaScript unit testing, because it can also reduce the amount of UI tests. And you might be wondering, reduce? Yes. And the advantage of less UI tests, and even though we're SaaS Labs, we're built on UI tests, I would even preach now to not execute 5,000 UI tests. I would kind of like preach now to say to you, use SaaS Labs in the right way and just test the things that really add value, really add business value, and test them in the UI. But let's dive a little bit deeper into the JavaScript part and see what you as a tester also can think of that will help you rethink your automation strategy. So in this case, if we would look in the login form, as I said, this has been built with React, and React is built based on components. They use some properties and they use a state. Well, that's kind of like the detail level I want to go to. But if you want to look at this, if we look at this part, then the most important part, the render phase, is where you would have code, where you would have code that would build the form. And just to make it a little bit more clear, we've got a username field here, we've got a password field here, we've got an error container, and we've got a login button. Then if you look at unit testing, you want to test them all kind of like separately. So we've got specific events here we can test to see what will happen with the code without using a UI. What will happen with all these events, handle submit, handle user change, handle pass change, what will happen with them if I would just write some unit test cases for them. So let's dive into them a little bit more. We've got, for example, the handle user change. We've got the handle password change and the handle submit. And as I said, this is a very, very simple application. But if you would see, for example, if something changes in the user state, that reflects into handle submit. And the same here is for the handle pass. If the password changes, it will be used in the handle submit. And if we're thinking about unit test cases and also about our UI, we would also see this. We would see 4 different error states. This is important. Just keep this in the back of your mind. The 4 states we also had in our UI. So let's dive into kind of like some stuff, dive into the component, the login class. Which test cases can we think of? And I'm not going to show you the code itself, just kind of like the description of the test case. And in this case, it should render correctly. And we should kind of like update the username state and the password state. All those test cases can be kind of like abstracted from the class that we've seen. And I think this is something that we as unit or as QA people can also do. We don't need to think about how we should test it, but basically what we want to test, what would add extra value. And if you would look at this, then again, we've got 4 different states here where we're testing the error states. But let's dive a little bit more. We also got some separate functions like validating credentials. As said, really easy code, but also really easy to test this with unit tests. And if we would write some test cases here, and if we basically would kind of like run those tests, if we already written those test cases, then you would see that with the unit test cases for the login form and some basic pages, we already have 46 test cases here, which will be executed in less than 4 seconds. And I think this is basically the magic. If we're also talking about the need for speed, you can already do a lot of stuff with your unit testing. So if we kind of like look back, so what did we prove now for the login flow? Well, first of all, we verified that the credentials validation, that we've tested that. We did that with methods and we did it in isolation. We also checked at the events where we would look at, for example, what would happen if I would press my key on a keyboard. That's something we can already test in unit test. We're using the mocked credentials methods, but we can easily do that because we already tested the credential validation separately. Then we also looked at components in using the mocked events. What will happen with the component if I do a key press? We also tested that in isolation. So you might think, okay, what do we need more? What do we need to do more here? Well, basically the following. We need to rethink our UI test cases. And if we rethink our UI test cases, we need to go back to our login form and then look back at this, the test case, the 6 test cases that we created. Again, do we want to verify if our page loaded? Well, I think that Guido and Rethinking already gave a good idea about, you can use, for example, visual comparison with this, visual regression, because you want to know the look and feel of your page. So I would say, yes, this is a test case that you should definitely have in your test suite. Then we would look at, for example, the happy flow again. Well, in my opinion, yes, this should be a test case where you kind of like integrate services, where you use your backend and you would go to the next page. So yes, this would be, I think, a test case that should definitely be in your UI test set. Then we look at the error flows. And hopefully you remember that when we were writing our unit test cases, we already got a test case here for the username error. We also had a test case here for the password error. We also had a test case for the username and password didn't match error. And we also had a test case for the logged out user. So you might rethink about this. Is it really adding value for you? Is it adding business value for testing all those 4 error stages? Because basically they're doing the same. They're triggering an endpoint, they're triggering the API, and they're triggering JavaScript to do something with the response. And the advice I would give if you would need to rethink this part is to look at a test case where basically the state is being updated for both fields and an API call is being done. So you would use, for example, or the logged out or the standard, or how do you say the logged out test case, or the credentials didn't match. But if you do that test case, then you could burn 3 test cases. There's someone entering, opening his mic. Yeah, thank you. If you can close it, awesome. This will bring you back to 3 test cases. 3 test cases executed on all those platforms means 7 configurations, in the end, 21 test cases. And this will reduce the time to market because you will now have your feedback within 20 to 70 seconds, also based on the fact if you can do proper parallelization. So it's really important to look what you do where. What's the responsibility of each layer? And this is a way how this could improve your time to market. And if we would also look at the phases that we have, the amount of test phases, and my mouse, yes, then you would have some options for your UI. You've got your manual testing where you test with multiple senses, because if you do automation, you're only focusing on a few things. When you look at it manually with your eyes, you would see a lot of things that you might not want to see. Then we also have got those UI integration testing where you run a whole part of your app or a small part of your app using mocks. Then you also got the end-to-end testing where you're running your complete app also using real devices. And then last but not least, also what Guido and Raveen mentioned, you've got your visual testing. You can do it with paid or open source solutions, and 9 out of 10 times those open source solutions are just pixel by pixel comparison solutions. And if you would then think, okay, what can I do where? Well, basically the manual testing will be done in each phase. Even though you would say, I want to do everything automated, believe me, even when you're developing your test case or developing a feature itself, you're already doing manual testing. Then the UI integration testing can be done, for example, during development. You can do it on each commit, you can do it on each PR. And you can then think, should I do it cross-browser? Well, that depends on risks, that depends on value, the business value you would get out of it, and also the time you would have. And what you would see here a lot with a lot of our customers is that they're saying the UI integration testing where I'm using my mocks, I do that on 1 or 2 browsers. And I would do, for example, the end-to-end testing or the rest of all the browsers in a nightly build. And then last but not least, if you were talk about visual testing, the advice, if you're going to integrate that, do that, for example, in a nightly build, not on every commit or every PR, because that will give you tons of information that might overflow you with information. If you don't know what to do with it. Do this also cross-browser, and like I said, you can even do that in a UI integration layer where you're just using mocks, because the responses, it doesn't matter which response you get, you just need to have the same response in each screenshot, in each point where you want to make that screenshot. There are some things that might help you to even think about what can I test where. And one of the things, especially for front end, and I don't know if your company is already using that, is, for example, Storybook. Because with Storybook, you can isolate your components, can isolate the look and feel, but also how you should create some test cases for it. This is just for a simple component, but you can even add certain features in a mocked state also into Storybook. So these are the things that could help you test the things at the right level, get the right speed and the right confidence of each layer. So If we would now go back to the business value, then we now also know, hopefully everybody paid attention, we now know what the money wants. Basically, what does the manager of our manager's manager want? We also now know how an automation strategy can help with that. And also based on this, based on the layers, we now also know where we need to put our attention and also our automation focus on by just breaking it down. Every layer has its own responsibility. If you're in a UI team, 9 out of 10 times, you're not responsible for the things that the API team is doing. You need to test the integration, but the API team is responsible for their own quality. Make sure that you got that covered in your organization or within the teams that you're working with. So now that we've looked at this, also let's take a look at how you can optimize your test cases now, how you can kind of like get that speed, the time to market with really, I think, useful tips. So let's take a look at this. And if you want to score some instant speed, and this is something for people who use frameworks other than JavaScript frameworks. JavaScript frameworks 9 out of 10 times handle starting and quitting the driver for you. If you would look at Java frameworks, Ruby frameworks, or other frameworks that are not JavaScript based, you need to do that yourself. And if you do not do this on, for example, Sauce Labs, if you're not quitting your driver after each test, then the test session of a VM or of a real device in the cloud will be open for at least 90 seconds. That's the default timeout. That means that if you only have a limited amount of instances you could use, you're stuck with one instance you cannot use. It will take you 90 seconds at least. So quit your driver after each test, and it will definitely speed up your test cases and also speed up the usage and optimize the usage of the concurrency you have in Sauce Labs. Then in Sauce Labs, you can also add the following capabilities. Extended debugging, put it to false. Do not use it everywhere. I'm going to highlight extended debugging in a few minutes. So you also have the option for screenshots. Laszlo also mentioned it, that if you're going to execute something in our cloud, with the automation, we create screenshots at points where we think that the page could change, a click, a input, a URL change, that kind of stuff. If you don't want them, just disable it. It will save you some time releasing the instance, because when a test is done, we store all the assets, and that will take a few seconds. And that amount of seconds, if you don't have that, the instance will be released sooner, so you can just use it for a new test case. Same also for storing the video. You can also say never store the video. Or what you can do, you can provide the capability video upload on pass. If you put it to false, it will only upload a video when the test case errored out. So you would have kind of like the video always when there's an issue. If there's no issue, you don't have a video. This will speed up your test also. It's only a small percentage, but if you do that for all small things, it might save you 10%. So all small bits help. Then there's also something extra, something you really need to realize if you look at the architecture of Selenium and also look at the architecture of Appium. Because basically every Selenium call is a web request going to the cloud and going back from the cloud. And when you communicate on your local machine, you would have very fast test case because you do not have that communication over the web. If you're using Sauce Labs, you always have that communication. And the less web requests you do, the less latency you have. And let me just give you an example of that one. When I started at Sauce Labs in 2018, I needed to go to the UK to a customer, and the customer, before I went to the UK, the customer asked me, okay, we're seeing some latency in our test cases. And I said, okay, just provide me an execution in the cloud, because I'm not going to review your framework, it's your baby, and if I'm going to tell you your baby is ugly, you're not going to listen to me. So I'm only going to tell you if your baby is crying out loud or if it's not crying out loud. So let us take a look at the execution. And when you're using Sauce Labs, you would see all the commands on the right. And when I looked at this before I went to the UK, I was like, this is kind of strange. I see a login feature here, and I kind of like recreated this because I cannot use, due to GDPR, the execution of the customer itself. So I recreated this situation. And I saw that the login flow, it had 170 WebDriver calls, and it took 29 seconds. And 29 seconds is not too long. On the other hand, if you would look at the amount of events, that's a lot of events. So I looked into the execution, and what I found, you can see it there with the arrows, we're loading a URL, then we're verifying if 2 elements are there. And just to see if they're displayed, we're verifying if the username is displayed and the password is displayed. And I was like, okay, but this, you already have 2 extra WebDriver calls that are not needed. Just verify one certain element, and if that element is on the page, you as a user already know if you can interact with that page. So already remove one of the 2 verifications. But when I looked deeper into the execution, I saw the following. It was happening here again. He was doing exact the same. And I had a conversation when I was at the office of the customer, and he was like, oh, is our framework doing this? I didn't know that, because we are calling the login flow already. So the automation framework, it had some features somewhere hidden in the code that it would already load the URL and verify if the URL was loaded. So he was now doing this twice. So this already gave the customer a good insight of what his framework was doing. But when I was diving into some commands extra, I saw this. I saw that he wanted to add a value to the login form, to the username form, but in the end, he was executing 5 WebDriver calls here to find the element. When he found the element, he was trying to verify if the element was displayed. If the element was displayed, then he would clear the value, and then he would add the value. So we had 5 different WebDriver calls here, and this could be done in at least 3 WebDriver calls. But this was also something that I saw for all, it was kind of like a pattern for all the interactions he was doing, for a click, for filling data. And if you would look at this, then why should you check the username again? Because you already verified if the username was there a few WebDriver calls before. So when we sat together, we optimized this, and we went back from 170 events to 90 events, doing exactly the same. And the advantage of this was that by doing exactly the same with less web events, we went from 29 seconds to 21 seconds, a reduction of 8 seconds, meaning around 30% reduction. By not doing anything extra, just looking at the framework and what the framework was doing. And I mentioned before, there was a pattern. And the pattern that he had in his test case had to do with the wait strategy. And this is something that we see a lot. First of all, the wait strategy that a lot of people could have is sleeps, kind of like having the hard sleeps, implicit waits, and explicit waits. Well, if you have sleeps, pause, or whatever in your code, and there's no explanation in your code why you're doing that, I would always remove them. If I need to do a framework review, no sleeps unless it's documented. So if you have them in your code, remove them and see what happens. Because you should use or the implicit or the explicit wait. And there are a lot of discussion which one you should use. To be honest, I don't care. Just use a proper waiting strategy. The second one, and this was kind of like the pattern that I was seeing, the customer was using a wait, act, wait strategy, where if he wanted to click on something, he was first going to verify if the element was displayed. So let's take a look at the Java code that the customer was using. And I kind of like I said, I recreated this. So if you have some good remarks about my Java knowledge, please let me know in the chat afterwards. But basically what the customer was doing when he was clicking on an element, he was first verifying if the element was there. And if the element was there, he would click on it. But on the other hand, if you would do that for all elements on the page, and you already know that your page is loaded, you're slowing yourself down. If you're doing this on your local machine, you will not see this. But when you're doing this in the cloud, then you would see some slowness, some latency here. And what you could do here, something we advise, is to use something like act, wait, act. And I know this is an anti-pattern. It is not something that architects would normally advise you to do. But basically what we're doing here, we're just clicking on the element. 9 out of 10 times, it's already there. And if it's not there, catch the exception, wait for the element, and again, try to click on it. This will help you increase or decrease the execution time. Then it's not only, if you would look, for example, at the wait, act, wait strategy, it's not only something that you created, it's also something that frameworks could have created. And now I want to look at some JavaScript parts. I also used Protector for a few years, and I also saw that when I was executing test cases of Protector on the cloud, in comparison to my local machine, it was slower. So what I did here is I just compared two frameworks, and not because I'm a huge fan of WebDriver IO, but just I wanted to use two of the most used frameworks in our cloud that are Protector and WebDriver IO, and it just created the same test cases, doing exactly the same. At least that's what I thought. Because when I executed it on Sauce Labs, I saw that Protector was taking 22 seconds, and WebDriver IO, doing exactly the same, was only taking 15 seconds. So when I took a look at the details, I saw that Protector is executing all those commands and asking Angular, are you ready? Are you ready? Are you ready? Can I do something extra? Can I click on this? Are you ready? A total of 46 event calls, taking them 22 seconds. If I would compare that with WebDriver IO, it only took 22 events. So it's not only the wait strategy you create, it could also be something that's in the framework itself that could slow down the execution, and especially when you're using the cloud. So not to say here you should use WebDriver IO, maybe you should, but the framework itself can also be the limiting factor here in the execution time. Those are kind of like the small things you could do. Kind of look at your framework, but there's more. And this is what we call superpowers. And you might have seen this movie, really like it. I got two kids, they also like it. But basically, when we're talking about superpowers, we're talking about using proper parallelization. And I want to give you some very plain examples, very easy examples. For example, you've got 100 test cases. You're using Sauce Labs. Your average execution time is 1 minute. If you would have one virtual machine, then you can only run them sequentially, so it will take you 100 minutes. Very important here is that if you want to debug these test cases, this is really easy to do because they're very small. You only have a few WebDriver calls in each test. This is something that we see a lot with our customers. They've got 20 test cases. A few of those 20 test cases just take 30 minutes. And even though the customer has 100 parallel VMs, they can only use 20 of them, and the execution time will be 30 minutes. And because of those 30 minutes, it's pretty hard to debug those test cases because you've got a lot of WebDriver calls. And this is kind of like the gold standard. It's yellow, sorry, but this is the gold standard where we say, okay, what if you would have those 100 test cases? What if it will take 1 minute? And what if you would have those 100 VMs? Then you will get that feedback. So you can also play with the parallelization to get that proper feedback. But there are some downsides. You cannot always do the parallelization. And I already mentioned one before, it's your test data. But let's get back to the smart. Because if you're thinking about doing proper parallelization, you need to be able to scale your test cases. You need to do that by using atomic test cases. And with atomic test cases, I mean that you have a test case that doesn't have 20 scopes, that doesn't do the login, select a product, go to the cart, from the cart, go to the checkout, and then from the checkout, go to the summary page. That's too long. Maybe if you have one test case to test it all, it's good. But try to isolate test case. Say, okay, I want to only focus on login. I only want to focus on the cart. I only want to focus on the checkout. That's better. And then also think about autonomous test cases. And with autonomous, we mean if you're going to run, for example, your login flow, it doesn't matter which order you have for all those test cases. You can even run them independently from each other. So create atomic and autonomous test cases. It's really important. When you're starting also with your automation, also try to keep them quick and also start your parallelization as soon as possible. And one of the reasons for starting it as soon as possible is that you will see some challenges you might have. And that will bring us back to the test data management. Because for the test data management, what we see with our customers is that there are 4 types of test data management. You've got customers who are using the grab and hope. And what I mean with that is that, take, for example, you go to a web shop. You're using a real database, real services, and you want to order some new sneakers for summer. Then your size, there are only 3 of them. So if you want to do the automation, you can only run it 3 times. The fourth time, it will fail because there's no stuck. And this is basically what we knew with grab and hope. If you use grab and hope, your test cases will just fail in the end. Then we've got customers who are using fixtures, and I must say I'm also guilty for that one. When I was working at a large bank in the Netherlands, we always had those large Excel sheets of customers. We added those customers in our databases, and then we had customer A who had property A, B, and C, and then we had customer B who had C, D, and E, and then in the end we had a new feature, and then we needed to add more customers, and we got more larger Excel sheets, and it was kind of like a pain. Try to prevent this. This will prevent speeding up your test cases. If we would look at the other two, then we're talking about the ideal world. We're talking about, for example, just in time, where we say we can flush the database, insert data, execute the test cases, flush the database again. And especially now with all Docker containers and like the new technologies we can use, this might be easier to do. Or what you can also do is use mocking, where you have a mocking server that will host the responses and give you the opportunity to execute test cases in parallel and giving you back the proper response. So this will also help you kind of like speed up your test cases and kind of like focus on the things that you really need to test. But there's more. If we go back to the execution, I want to kind of like highlight a little bit more what you can do with parallelization. I created a test case. I call it anti-pattern, and in a few seconds you will also see why. In this case, I'm executing this in an environment where I cannot run my test cases in parallel. I need to run them sequentially. You will already see, even though that some test cases will take only a minute, that's kind of like the max, the duration of that specific build was 5 minutes and 55 seconds, so almost 6 minutes. And if you would look at the test case we have here, then you would see that we have multiple scopes here. We're testing multiple stuff in one file. And this is not the best way to do it. But if we just use this, still the same test case, and we're now able to use mocking or just in time, so we can do proper parallelization, then if you would execute it on SaaS Labs, for example, then the duration of your build will be the total duration time of your longest test case. And in this case, yes, it's IE11. The rest is around kind of like 35 seconds, but IE11 here is slowing you down. But it's only slowing you down from 6 minutes back to 1 minute and 10 seconds. So this is, what is it, 70% reduction already. So this kind of like being able to run something in parallel based on your environment would already help you, but there's more. Because again, what I said, if you would look at your test cases, and especially all the test cases we had in the anti-pattern, we would have a test case like this, where basically the scope of the test case would be, I would like to validate that the user can do the checkout, and this part is not really the scope of my test case. So I need to find a way where I kind of like remove this part, not using UI. And we can do that. And if you can do that, you can execute it again. And then if you would execute all your test cases, then your build time went back from 1 minute and 11 seconds for all those test cases to 40 seconds. And again, IE11 here is bugging us. Otherwise, we would be able to reduce it even more. But if you would look at this, then you might be wondering, okay, how can I execute this and how can I optimize this? How can I remove that, kind of like those extra steps that are not really scope of my test case? Well, I created a video for this one and I hope you can see it. I hope it's not too fast, because we're now going from the login directly to the cart. Let me show it again. We're opening the browser, we see the login form, but we're not going to the overview of all the articles and adding them to our cart. No, we're just going directly to the cart, and we are seeing the products already in our cart, as you can see here. So you might be wondering, how can you do that? Well, for web pages, this is pretty easy to do. And it depends also how your application has been built. But in this case, I just need to use some session storage. And in some case in your application, you might need to use cookies or whatsoever. But basically by using that, you can set a state for your application and just jump from one feature to the other one. And you just need to keep in mind that you do not forget to test login properly. You do not need to forget to test adding stuff in the overview page. Every part has its own functionality. And if you can do that, and that's its own responsibility, if you do that, you can run them more in parallel. And if you do that, you can reduce the execution time, your build time. So now we can just focus on this. This will give us kind of like the feedback that we really, really need. So hopefully you now got an idea about what you can do with your current test case to kind of like speed everything up, like the need for speed. Listen to the need for speed. Look at your test cases, see what you can do where. But there are also some things that Selles Labs can help you with. And I want to dive into the new ways on how you can use Selles Labs. And I want to start with one feature. It's a feature that we already have in our application for around, I think, 3 years. It's the best kept secret. And yeah, I want to show it to you today. And that's extended debugging. I already mentioned that you can enable it or disable it in the cloud. Let me just kind of like dive a little bit more into what extended debugging can do for you. Normally, if you're doing your development, if your developer is developing test cases or developing features, he also wants to debug, for example, the JavaScript logs. He wants to see if there are some specific errors. But sometimes if you have a web application, you also want to verify if a specific call for the analytics to Google Analytics or whatsoever is being executed. And sometimes you also want to verify how your application will respond if you're on slow connections, if you have a bad Wi-Fi or a bad GPS connection. So what can you do? Well, basically, by default, you cannot do anything with it because Selenium uses the driver and it does not have access to the application itself. It only can use the driver and kind of like listen or execute actions from the outside, not from the inside. So this is very hard to debug. It's very hard also to discover issues. And yeah, as you can also see here, it also has an inconsistent vendor support. So what we did, and this is basically only for Firefox and Chrome currently, we're also busy looking into Edge now for this. But what we did is that we added extended debugging. And with extended debugging for Firefox and Chrome, you will already get 2 things extra. If you enable it, you will also see some more information about the JavaScript errors. You can download the logs, and you can also download a HAR file with all the statics that are being downloaded, the API calls, CSS data, which is downloaded in one file. This will give you more information, what you could improve. And we also added, and this is specifically for Chrome, we added 2 new things. We added commands and we added log types. And let me just start with commands, because this is kind of like I said, the best kept feature. Not a lot of people know that you can already do this with Selles Labs. If you're using Chrome, you've got the option to intercept calls. You're able to intercept not only API calls, but all the assets that are being downloaded. You can mock them, you can block them, you can replace them during tests. It's pretty easy to use. And how easy is it to use? Well, if you're using a JavaScript framework or if you're using a Java framework, just use the JavaScript executor function. You provide a string, which is Selles::intercept, and then you need to provide an object with a URL. And that URL can even use regular expressions where you don't need to match the complete URL, you can just match certain parts of it. Then you can say redirect it, this is your new response, or this is the error that you need to give. And you might be wondering, okay, how will this look? Okay, so I created 3 test cases for you. In this case, I created a test case where I'm going to a URL, which will show you 20 cards based on an API call. So that's the first test case I'm going to execute. And the second test case I'm going to execute here is I'm going back to the web page, which is doing an API call, but I'm just replacing the API response with a custom response. And then the last test case, I'm going to my own blog and I'm going to replace all images with one of my favorite series from the past. And hopefully you will see that. Hopefully you're from kind of like the same time that I'm from. So I'm now going to execute it here. We're going to start the browser. And in the browser, you will now see the page loaded and there are 20 cards. Now I'm going to reload the page again and there's only 1 card. I mocked the response. Now, this is the last test case. This is my website. I need to maintain it better, sorry. But on this website, I'm going to replace all the images just with one image from the A-Team. I really love the A-Team. It was one of my favorite series together with Knight Rider. But basically with with extended debugging, you can intercept and just replace calls. This is really, really useful, but be aware of the fact you can only use this on Chrome. Then we also have this. This is kind of like an extra command where you can do, for example, network throttling. And I'm not going to show you an example on how it will show during execution. I think you can already imagine what you can do. But basically with the throttle, you can just see what will happen under certain conditions. We already have kind of like specific conditions, profile names, which you can use, or you can just adjust download, upload, and latency yourself in Sauce Labs on Chrome. And then you can create your own profile. So basically with this, you can just see what will happen with my application if there's no connection or if there's a bad connection. Do we provide the right spinners, for example, to our customers? Do we give them the right feedback? Really useful. Then there's also something to access to look at the logs, where you can look at network, you can look at metrics, and you can look at timing. And those can be really useful if you need to do some assertions. If you want to see if the execution on a specific API call has been done with the proper parameters, and also see if that specific call has been made to Google Analytics. So by using extended debugging, you've got some extra power to verify certain parts of your application or to mock certain parts of your application. And if you would enable extended debugging, you will get something extra also in your UI. In your UI, you will get kind of like a DevTools experience at the bottom, where you would see all the API calls or all the asset calls that are being done. And here you can also see that there is an issue with the favicon, the icon to show on the page. It's not there, it's giving us a 404. So this could be very useful, especially when you're missing some JavaScript files or missing some CSS styles. You can just do assertions also on this. You can also download the hard file. And if you want to do that, you can use our API. Afterwards, when the test is done, you're able to use that API, or you can also access it from the UI where you go to the metadata tab. There you would see the automatic generated screenshots, the automatic created video, but also download the hard file. Then there's more. You can also download the JavaScript console logs. And again, with an API or just using it through the UI. You can just go to the view logs, open the select box and just select console logs. I also wanted to get back to one of the features one of the things that I mentioned. If you want to speed up your test cases, don't always use extended debugging. If the focus is not to use extended debugging to mock certain things on your browsers, do not use extended debugging because we store more assets. So releasing your VM will take some more time. And that's the reason why I mentioned not to always use it. Just use the force wisely. So this was the first thing in how Sauce Labs can help you. But we also have something else, which is called Biometric Login. And before we start, all vendors like Apple and Android have different names. Some call it Touch ID and Face ID. For example, Apple, for Android, you've got fingerprint, and for other vendors, you have different names. So if we're talking about biometric login or biometric supports, we're talking about all these options. So let's take a look at it. So why do we have biometric login? You can already see it here in the movie. Well, basically we have those options to easily log into our phone or iPhone, for example, but also to easily log into your application. And more companies are implementing these features into their apps. And when I was working at a large bank in the Netherlands, they were one of the first companies that were using biometric login to just log into the application, but also being able to authenticate and approve transactions. So it makes it very easy for customers. But normally you would kind of like test this with a physical device that you have at the office. But yeah, with current circumstances, you're not able to access those devices if you didn't bring them home. So I think Sauce Labs can also help you with that. And that's one of the features that I want to highlight. And let's just take a look at the 3 ways you could use it. First of all, you could use it during manual executions. Currently, you can only use that on iOS. We're busy with Android, but it's supported already for iOS. There is an extra exclamation mark, or how do you say it, an asterisk there, because there is a difference in the way we can mock it, because basically that's what we're doing. We're mocking the response of Face ID or Touch ID. But as we all know, iOS is very secure. They're not allowing us to do a lot of stuff. And we've basically got 2 different types of stores on an iOS application, on an Apple application. You've got a secure store and you've got an insecure store. And it depends on your application if we can use the mocking. We only are able to mock the insecure store. But yeah, if you're using that, then you can use Touch ID and Face ID also for manual and for automated. I will show that later on. There's even another option. You can also execute this with automation on real devices, and you can also check this with Appium on Android emulators and iOS simulators. So let me just show you how you can do that with manual testing. You go to the mobile app, you just upload an application. In this case, I uploaded already an application. You select it, and you go to a phone that supports it. In this case, an iPhone XS. What will happen now is it will install the application on the device. This gives me the opportunity. On the right, you see a bar, and you hopefully also see a fingerprint there. That's the option you can use. You can only use that when you're in the new Sauce Labs UI, not in the old test object. In this case, our app has the option for Face ID. It will show you an alert. You go to the right, you say pass, then it will mock the response, and you're able to log into your application. If I would now log out, I could do kind of like the same also with the fields situation. I'm not able now to log in. Be aware of the fact is that we are mocking also the alerts. So this might look a little bit different in comparison to how it would look on a real device or on an emulator. But this is kind of like the option we can kind of like provide you to test this. But like I said, there are more options you can use. You can also do that on emulators and simulators. And this is just an example for using Biometric Login for iOS this is for iOS real devices, sorry, the automation part. Basically, if you want to use this, you only need to provide an extra capability in your capabilities when you start the device. And the extra capability is allow Touch ID enroll. And then the only thing you need to do in your automation script is to provide the command driver.touchid. Just take a look at which language you're using. This is kind of like an execution command for WebDriver IO and for Java, I think. But take a look at the link that's in there. You just provide if it should be a successful Touch ID or an unsuccessful Touch ID. And even though we're using Face ID on this specific phone, the commands will just be Touch ID. Now we get back to the emulators, because when you're using emulators in a cloud, you can also use that. And as you can see here now, we don't have the biometric login button on the page. But if you do driver.toggle enroll Touch ID, restart your app, you would have it. Now the simulator is ready to use it. You now only need to accept kind of like the alert that you're using Face ID. And now you're able to automate it also on an iOS simulator. This is pretty straightforward. For iOS, you don't need to do a lot of things. And if you want to see an example, there's a link, and we will share the slides afterwards. There's a link there, and you can use that link to see how you can implement this in your code. Then we also have Android, and Android is a little bit more difficult. Normally, Android is much easier in comparison to iOS, but in this case, Android doesn't have a very easy function like toggle enroll fingerprint or something. No, you really need to enable PIN code, enable fingerprint, like you as an end user would do that. So you still have the option to use it in the cloud. You still have the option to use it with an emulator. You only need to do a little bit extra. And in this case, if we would just watch the movie, we don't see the button here. Then I need to open the security settings. I need to enter a PIN. When I enter the PIN, I need to kind of like mimic or mock the fingerprint sensor. And when that is done, the button is there, and then I can use it. This was quite of an experience, and I must say there was a good friend of mine from Greece, Georges, who already created a blog post about this for Android 9. When I was automating this, I was able to do this for 7, 8, 9, and 10, because the flows between all those different emulators is different. So yeah, the process itself, it will take some steps. If you would go to the repository at the bottom, you know how to kind of like solve those issues. But be aware of the fact, if you do this on Android, you could use it, but you need to enable the fingerprint yourself in your automation script. You cannot provide a capability to do that. Okay, having said that, we've got a different feature or another feature, and this is image injection. And you might be, wow, image injection, but you also might be wondering, okay, image injection, what does it mean? What can you do with image injection? Well, you can do the following with it. Mobile apps can make our lives much easier. And especially, for example, we can scan QR codes. We can scan QR codes to get URLs. We can scan checks, and especially in the financial world, we have checks in the Netherlands. We've got a difficult word, which is called accept giro, kind of like the same of a check, kind of like paying stuff. You can scan those things and use that in your application. It's the same if you need to have an ID or need to have a driver's license to order certain stuff. You always want to do that. Use your camera. You can scan whatever you want with your device or with your app. But again, if we go back to what I was explaining for the biometric login, if you want to test this, if your app is supporting this, well, you've got your devices at the office. How can you do that? Well, I think I also got some great news now, because this is a feature that we're going to release in beta today, where you have the possibility to scan images, use that in your application, but because you're using a physical device in the cloud, you don't have access to the camera. We provide you the option just to provide an image. So you can do exactly the same, what you're seeing here on my private iPhone. You just log in, you open your app, in this case also with Face ID, you go to the QR code scanner, and you can just use that image to go, in this case, to the SaaS demo app. So how can you do that? Well, there are two ways to do that. First of all, you can only do this on real devices, and you can do that on Android, and you can do it on iOS. The second thing is that you can also do it in an automated way, again with Appium, and you can also do that on Android and on iOS real devices. Like I said, it's a beta. We started the beta today. The link is at the bottom. Again, you will get more information about it. But if you are a Sauce Labs customer and you want to use this in your automation script or in your manual testing, please contact us. Then we can add you to the program, and all feedback we can get on this feature will help you and also your pair customers. So how does it work? If you're using this for manual testing, you just go to the live testing part, the mobile app, upload your app, click on it. And there's one thing, because it's embedded, you need to enable it. And this means that we're going to re-sign your application, because we need to listen to the call that your application is going to make to the camera. Then you log in, again, in this case, just use Face ID, pretty easy. And then go to the QR code scanner. Now you would see that there's no image. You upload an image, in this case, the QR code, and now it will be marked to the camera. The camera knows how to respond, or the app knows how to respond. It needs to read the URL from the QR code, and it will do the actions. So this is basically how it can help you test the features that you need to test for your company, also in the cloud. But there's more. You can also do this with automation. And with automation, it's pretty simple, if I may say so. The only thing you need to do are two things. First of all, you need to provide a capability. That capability is called Sauce Labs Image Injection Enabled. You put it to true. Then in your script, and this is a part of, this is JavaScript, as you can see here, but you can do it with whatever language you want to do. You need to have an image, and normally that's a file, so you need to translate it to a base 64 string. Then you use driver.execute and provide that string with something with a prefix, which is called sauce::inject-image is. Then you're providing that string to the application, and then the application, when it's going to use the camera, knows what to do. So this can already help you with the automation. I already added some examples on the GitHub page. It's in JavaScript, but I hope that I explain it well enough, at least detailed enough for you to translate it to the language you're using. But this is a feature I think that could help also a lot of banks in the financial world, or even other companies that use, for example, IDs that they need to upload images. More information about the feature, what you can do or what you cannot do, or what you need to enable or disable, can be also found on the link you can see at the bottom. I think I've explained a lot what you can do with Selles Labs, and I think I gave you some options now to rethink about your automation strategy, to rethink about how can you optimize your test cases, and also shown you some features what Selles Labs can offer you to help you with your automation. I'm done now. We walked through, what is it? I think around 100 slides now in 1 hour and 10 minutes around that time. If you have any questions, I think this is the time to ask them.
We have one question from Pascal on Slack. So he's saying, I'm interested in QR scan feature, but didn't get all of your session because I have some meetings in parallel. Can you provide some information about this feature? And maybe Wim, if it's a long answer, you can answer that on Slack. It's up to you.
Yeah, I can also answer it on Slack, but like I said, we're going to share also the slides afterwards. There you will also find a link with a URL with more information. And if you're already an existing Selles Labs customer, please also contact your CSM, because it's a closed beta. So if you want to use it, yeah, you can only use it if we enable it for you. That's basically the only limitation you would have there. Yeah, thank you very much, everybody, for your attention. And like Paulina said, if you have questions, please contact us or through Slack or through your CSM or directly. And have a great day today.